was one area in which, in fact, we have fallen as a culture back into what I call paganism. It is nature worship rather than God worship. It's exactly what God called Abraham out from when Abraham lived in Ur among the Chaldeans. Chaldeans had gods of stars, moon. That's why the Muslims have the moon as their symbol. Ishtar and Baal are mentioned in the Bible. They had the river gods, and their life was controlled and directed and informed by what happened in nature. And if you go with the process I've just described in the 19th century, nature again becomes the source of life, encouragement, orientation, instead of what Scripture gives us, and that is we have a text that is in our face, that is inescapable, that informs us, that startles us, that stimulates us, that encourages and warns us. We are people of a text from God who is not identified with nature. He has created a natural world that functions naturally, but it is now a fallen world. We are people who need a text, a grammar, an explanation, not just the quietness of observing what happens. Anyway, the worship of nature to which so much of our society has returned is not just there where in the political elements of the green they say, you know, a tree is as valuable as a human being. We'll get to that next time, as one of the utopian visions. It's rather the assumption that somehow history is the voice of God, that events somehow reveal the mind of God. As a Presbyterian minister, I must say that's what's widespread in the Presbyterian churches, under the name of Calvinism, that God has ordained whatsoever comes to pass, meaning that everything that comes to pass is somehow okay. Well, not according to Scripture, not according to the person of Christ, who after all did not go to the Pharisees and say, somehow God has ordained for you to say whatever you say. He hasn't held people's hands when they were blind, sick, or whatever, coming to him and asking for help to say, God has ordained your blindness. He hasn't said, there's no indication in Scripture that Christ somehow approves of Herod's rule. You know, Scripture gives us the outside perspective, the need to understand what there is, and then the moral orientation as to whether what is also ought to be there, or whether I shouldn't do something against it, whether I shouldn't be a man in revolt against what is natural. In fact, in some sense or other, we all understand that when we understand how the need to impose culture over nature, to tame the wilderness, to make the world inhabitable, the way Isaiah talks about it in Isaiah 45, verse 18. You know, God did not create the world to be uninhabitable. Make it inhabitable. Impose on nature culture. But let us also impose on social flows a moral orientation. Where the individual is neglected, let us focus on the need to pay attention, because there's no such thing as loving mankind. There's only loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, you may have 6 neighbors, or a dozen, or a whole class full, but that's the obligation, to love your neighbor as yourself, not to be in love with what somehow nature produces, the flow of history produces, providence produces, as Lincoln would see it, or nature as Darwin would see it.